So, up until now, our discussion of agriculture has painted a generally positive picture of the innovations that have brought about these very significant increases in productivity and food security for the world, including the innovations that came with the Green Revolution and also the more recent advantages that are offered by GMO crops. But at the same time, the picture is not all rosy, and we have also touched on some of the negative consequences that have come with the modernization of agriculture. So, this section and the next one are dedicated to elaborating more on those negative consequences before finally transitioning into a discussion of alternative approaches and how we might do better. So, how this section will be structured is modeled after an earlier slide that you'll probably remember from a previous section where we went over the five main advancements that came out of the Green Revolution: high yielding crop varieties, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation techniques, and machinery and automation. So, you know now what benefits each of these have created. And now we're going to walk through them one by one and talk about their negative consequences, starting with the high yielding crop varieties. So, when high yielding crop varieties were adopted, many farmers went all in, meaning that they turned to monoculture, the practice of cultivating a single crop variety rather than a diverse community of different crops. So, the prefix mono means one, so monoculture is one crop. The high yielding crops were so much more productive and profitable that this made economic sense. But with the rise of monoculture as the dominant form of farming has come the loss of many traditional crop varieties that carry their own benefits. So, did you guys know that there are hundreds of different varieties of bananas in the world? Some of which you can see pictured here. Probably not, because 99% of the globally exported bananas today are just a single variety, the Cavendish banana. And this is the case for so many food crops, but I mentioned the Cavendish banana in particular because since the 1990s, the Cavendish banana has been threatened by an infectious fungus that causes a disease called banana wilt. And the fungus first appeared in Taiwan, and it is now spread to 20 countries, and it continues to spread and threaten global banana supplies. And this is the problem with monocropping. If you only raise one variety of a crop, then when something goes wrong with that particular variety, the potential losses are huge. And by edging out other traditional crop varieties, you lose out on desirable traits like drought resistance, pest resistance, disease resistance that make a food supply more diverse and also more robust. Next on our list of factors to look at is synthetic fertilizer use. So, we talked about this previously in the last chapter when we were looking at the nitrogen cycle. In many parts of the world, more and more synthetic fertilizer is being applied to cropland with diminishing returns on that investment because in many countries, a majority of that fertilizer is simply washing away. It's leaching into groundwater, it's washing into streams and rivers and ending up in the ocean. And when this happens, it triggers a phenomenon known as eutrophication, the process in which a body of water becomes overly enriched with excessive nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the most common limiting nutrients in soil. And as a result of this eutrophication, there is an explosion in the growth of algae. And although algae are photoautotrophs, remember that photoautotrophs also perform cellular respiration. They don't just perform photosynthesis, they also perform cellular respiration to extract energy from the carbohydrates they create. And this process consumes oxygen. So, consequently, this overgrowth of algae depletes the levels of oxygen in the water and creates dead zones where fish and other organisms cannot survive, and that can lead to ecosystem collapse. And you've seen this figure on the right before, where a red dot is placed over dead zones along coastal regions across the world. And furthermore, many of these species of algae actually release toxins that directly kill marine organisms. So, in one particularly dramatic example, in 1998, there was a massive eutrophication event that occurred in the waters around Hong Kong, and it devastated 22 of the island's 26 fish farms, killed 2,500 tons of fish, and led to the equivalent of 32 million US dollars in economic losses. The next item to address is synthetic pesticide use. This one we've touched on as well. So, as pesticide use has increased, the rates of resistance to those chemicals among pests has increased in tandem. On the left, you see the increases in insect resistance to Bt, and on the right, you see increases in weeds that are resistant to Roundup. Today, there are over 400 insect and mite pests that have developed resistance to insecticides, and over 70 different fungi that have developed resistance to fungicides. Also, the very common use of insecticides has had a negative impact on beneficial insects such as pollinators. So, insects that we don't want to kill, and actually, we are totally dependent on these insects for crops to survive and reproduce. And then finally, although the two pesticides that we talked about the most, which are Roundup and Bt, are generally quite safe, they are certainly not the only pesticides, and many pesticides are harmful to human health. And prolonged exposure to them can cause cancers, lung diseases, neurological problems, skin and eye diseases. And the primary effect of these exposures right now is taking place in developing countries where the regulatory systems for protecting human health and environmental health is less robust than it is here in the US. Next, we have irrigation. Irrigation is the provision of groundwater supply to croplands so that they don't have to rely on rainfall exclusively. So, whereas rainfall can be inconsistent from year to year, groundwater supplies are more stable, or at least they have been historically, but now even groundwater supplies are being threatened as well. And as irrigation practices expanded, agriculture began to move into areas of the world that completely lacked the rainfall needed to support those crops. So they were fully relying on irrigation to do the job. And Arizona, unfortunately, is the leading example of agriculture being established in a region that lacks the natural water resources to support it. So, what you see here is a chart published by the US Department of Agriculture, the USDA, showing rates of irrigation water usage per acre of cropland by state. And while the state of California is on top with the largest number of acres of irrigated cropland, and therefore uses the largest volume of irrigation water, if you look at the average amount of water that farmers have to use on each acre of cropland to get crops to grow, Arizona is by far the highest. We have to use more than 50% more groundwater per acre to raise crops here compared to the next closest state on the list, California. So in Arizona, the average amount of water applied per acre of crops is 4.7 acre feet of water, where an acre foot is a measurement of water. It's the volume of water required to cover 1 acre to a depth of 1 foot. And it's the equivalent of 325,851 gallons. So the reason why Arizona has to use so much irrigation water, so much more than any other state, is because we just don't have the rainfall. So more water has to be artificially supplied from rivers, namely the Colorado River is the main one, as well as underground aquifers. And this puts strain on those water resources for other sectors like residential water use, commercial and industrial water use, and of course the needs of ecosystems, because it's not just humans who need this scarce water resource. Increased rates of irrigation have also led to problems with salinization of cropland. So remember, salinity is the concentration of salt in the soil. River water and other sources of groundwater have a much higher salt concentration compared to rainfall. So, by applying river water to cropland through this intensive irrigation process, you end up introducing a high amount of salts that accumulate over time and harm the quality of the soil and the productivity of the plant growth. And one interesting fact about salinization in our region is that it has been going on for a long time and probably affected pre colonial civilizations as well. So you may know that this region was historically occupied by an indigenous community known today as the Hohokam, who thrived in the Sonoran Desert from approximately the year 300 to about the mid 15th century. And at that point, their communities were abandoned rather suddenly. And there's been a lot of archaeological and anthropological investigation into the cause of why these communities were suddenly abandoned. And some scholars argue that salinization of cropland was partly responsible, given that these communities had constructed these highly sophisticated irrigation systems that drew from the Salt and Gila rivers for raising their crops. So, one school of thought is that the abandonment of settlements was driven by the failure of agriculture, which was caused by, in part, salinization of the soil from use of river water irrigation. And we don't know this for certain, but it's certainly a potential warning for us residents of the Sonoran Desert as we continue to intensively irrigate our cropland with river water today. So, the final factor that we need to discuss is machinery and automation. So, in other words, the development of machines that took over the brunt of the labor associated with farming, which includes planting, spraying, harvesting, tilling, threshing, processing, many other steps. And while this was certainly more efficient, the reliance on these sophisticated and keyword expensive machines led to a consolidation of agriculture into the hands of a small number of large commercial farming operations and the displacement of small farmers. And you can see this reflected in the number of farms versus the size of farms over time in the US. So as you see in the line shown in blue, number of the line shown in blue is the number of farms in the US, and the number of farms has dropped off dramatically over the past 70 years. The line in green is the average size of a farm, and that has gone up. So the number of farms continues to decline. 20 million more farms were lost or absorbed by the larger farms between the years 2007 and 2022. And the message here is that the farming industry is becoming consolidated with a small number of very large, profitable operations accounting for most of the production. And this has eroded the livelihood of the rural communities that have historically made their living through farming, but now can't compete with the large operations that can afford to upgrade to this expensive and sophisticated machinery.